My name is Allison Parker, and I was 35 years old when I walked into my parents' wedding anniversary believing, for the first time in my life, that maybe things were finally different. I had no idea that by the end of that night, I would understand exactly where I stood in my family and why staying any longer would destroy whatever self-respect I had left. From the outside, my parents' marriage looked flawless. Decades together, admired by relatives, praised by friends, held up as an example of commitment and sacrifice. Growing up, I heard people tell them how lucky they were, how beautiful their family was, how proud they must be of their children. I used to smile politely during those moments, even as something twisted inside me, because I never quite felt like I belonged in the picture everyone admired. In our house, love was measured, approval was earned. My parents never said they were disappointed in me outright. They didn't need to. Disappointment lived in the pauses, in the comparisons, in the way my accomplishments were acknowledged briefly before the conversation moved on to someone else. I learned early that if I wanted peace, I had to be agreeable. If I wanted harmony, I had to lower my expectations. By the time I reached my 30s, I had built a life that looked stable from the outside. A steady career, my own apartment, independence I worked hard for. But no matter how much I grew, some part of me was still that child waiting to be chosen. Waiting for my parents to look at me and say, without reservation, that I was enough. So when my mother called to invite me to their wedding anniversary celebration, something hopeful stirred in me. It wasn't just a small dinner. It was a big event. A formal venue. Extended family. Friends from different stages of their life. Speeches were planned. My parents sounded excited, almost proud, when they talked about it. My mother even asked for my help organizing a few things, and that small request felt bigger than it should have. I took it as a sign. In the weeks leading up to the anniversary, I did everything I could to be supportive. I helped review guest lists. I offered suggestions when asked. I paid for part of the decorations without mentioning it. I told myself not to expect anything in return, but deep down, I imagined that night ending with a moment of acknowledgement. A toast. A thank you. Something that said I mattered too. There were warning signs I chose to ignore. My parents corrected me sharply in front of others during planning meetings. My ideas were dismissed more quickly than anyone else's. When relatives called to ask about my life, their questions made it clear my parents hadn't shared much about me. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself this night wasn't about me. The evening of the anniversary arrived wrapped in elegance. The venue glowed with warm lights, the kind that make everything look softer and more forgiving. Tables were perfectly set. Music played quietly in the background. A slideshow of my parents' life together looped on a large screen, filled with smiling photos and carefully chosen memories. Guests greeted my parents with admiration. Compliments flowed freely. People spoke about love, endurance, and family. I stood nearby, smiling, adjusting my dress, reminding myself to be present and grateful. I was proud of them. Despite everything, I truly was. As the night progressed, I noticed how easily my parents slipped into their public personas. Warm, charming, generous with laughter. They moved through the room like they belonged on that stage, soaking in praise. I hovered at the edges, talking politely with relatives, answering questions about work, listening more than I spoke. When it was time for speeches, the room slowly quieted. Chairs turned toward the front. Glasses were set down. My heart started beating faster, and I wasn't sure why. I told myself it was just nerves, just the emotional weight of the occasion. Friends spoke first. Stories about my parents' early years, about challenges they overcame together, about the family they built. Laughter and applause filled the room. With each speech, the image of a perfect marriage grew stronger. I felt proud, but also strangely small, like I was watching a story that didn't quite include me. Then my parents stepped forward together and took the microphone. The room fell completely silent. They looked happy, confident. My mother smiled out at the crowd. My father cleared his throat, preparing to speak. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. I stood a little straighter without realizing it, my chest tightening with anticipation. Part of me hoped they would thank the people who helped make the night possible. Part of me hoped, quietly and dangerously, that they might mention me. Not in a grand way, just enough to feel seen. My father began by talking about commitment, about sacrifices made over the years, about how marriage teaches you patience and realism. His tone was relaxed, practiced, like he had rehearsed these words. People nodded along. Some laughed softly at his jokes. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. He talked about how raising children hadn't always gone the way they expected. He laughed lightly, as if setting up a harmless joke, and said that not every child turns out to be a source of pride, no matter how hard you try. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the room. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Heat rushed to my face. My hands went cold. My mother took the microphone next, smiling in that calm, composed way she always used when she wanted to sound reasonable. She spoke about disappointment as if it were a lesson learned. She talked about children who make choices that embarrass their parents, about how hard it is to accept when someone doesn't live up to expectations. Then she paused and looked directly at me. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. She spoke about a daughter who was too independent, too stubborn, who chose the wrong priorities in life. She said some people confuse self-sufficiency with success and don't realize how much they've failed until it's too late. The room grew quiet in a way that felt sharp, not respectful. I could feel eyes turning toward me. Curious, confused, judgmental. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I wanted to believe this wasn't happening. I wanted to believe someone would interrupt, that this would stop. But my parents kept going, passing the microphone back and forth, building on each other's words like they had planned this moment together. They spoke calmly. They smiled. They framed their cruelty as honesty, as wisdom earned over decades. Laughter broke out again, hesitant but real. And that sound hurt more than anything they said. I realized then that this wasn't accidental. This wasn't a joke gone wrong. This was deliberate. Standing there, surrounded by people, I understood that my parents had chosen this stage, this audience, to finally say what they had always believed about me. And as the applause swelled around them, I felt something inside me shift, hard and irreversible. Because whatever came next, I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. I would never be able to unhear this. And I would never be able to stay the same after what they had just done. For a few seconds after my parents finished speaking, I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Applause filled the room, loud and confident, like nothing terrible had just happened. People stood up, smiling, clapping for my parents as if they had delivered something brave and honest instead of cruel. I stayed exactly where I was, frozen in a space that suddenly felt too small to hold me. My parents stepped away from the microphone, still smiling, still basking in the approval of the crowd. My mother laughed softly, touching my father's arm, and that small gesture hurt more than the words themselves. It told me this was not a misunderstanding. This was not a slip. This was agreement. I could feel eyes on me again. Some people looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others watched openly, curiosity written across their faces. A few wore expressions that suggested sympathy, but none of them said anything. No one interrupted. No one defended me. The humiliation didn't end when the speech ended. It lingered, stretching out in the silence between claps and conversations. I told myself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The way I had taught myself to do in stressful meetings, difficult conversations, moments when I needed to stay composed. I reminded myself that causing a scene would only confirm the picture my parents had just painted of me. Difficult, emotional, a problem. That was when it hit me. They weren't just humiliating me. They were controlling the narrative. They knew exactly how I would respond. Or rather, how I wouldn't. They counted on my silence the same way they always had. Silence had kept the peace for years. Silence had allowed them to say what they wanted without consequences. Silence had trained everyone around us to believe their version of me. I stayed quiet, just like they expected. As people began moving around again, the noise returned to normal levels. Music resumed. Glasses clinked. Conversations picked back up as if my parents hadn't just publicly reduced my life to a cautionary tale. I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching the room through thick glass. My body was there, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. A distant cousin approached me first. She gave me a tight smile and said something about how parents mean well, how family dynamics are complicated. I nodded politely, even thanked her, and hated myself a little for how automatic that response was. Another relative patted my arm and told me not to take it personally. Someone else joked awkwardly about how speeches can go wrong. No one said they were sorry. I glanced toward my parents, hoping against reason that maybe they would come over, that maybe they would see my face and realize what they had done. But they didn't look at me. They were busy accepting congratulations, laughing, enjoying the night they had carefully curated. I understood then that waiting for acknowledgement was pointless. The realization didn't come with tears or anger at first. It came with something colder, clearer. I saw my childhood laid out in a single moment. All the times I had swallowed my feelings to avoid conflict. All the times I had been told I was too sensitive, too independent, too much or not enough. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the pattern finally stepping into the light. I excused myself quietly and walked toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. Each step felt heavy, like I was moving underwater. When I reached the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back at me. My face was pale, my eyes unfocused, my expression carefully neutral. I leaned against the sink and let myself feel it. The humiliation burned now, sharp and undeniable. Not just because of what was said, but because it was said publicly, intentionally, and without remorse. I thought about all the effort I had put into maintaining a relationship that required me to constantly minimize myself. I thought about how much energy it took to be the easy child. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had always avoided. What if I stopped trying? The thought scared me. Leaving felt drastic. Final. I had always believed that family was something you endured, not something you questioned. You stayed, you adapted, you forgave, even when it hurt. Walking away felt like failure. It felt like confirming every accusation they had just made. But standing there, alone in that hallway, I realized something even more frightening. Staying would destroy me. I returned to the main room briefly, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to be sure. I needed to see them one more time with clear eyes. My parents were still laughing, still enjoying themselves. My father raised his glass, my mother beamed. They looked relieved, like they had finally said something they had been holding in for years. I caught my mother's eye for a split second. She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied. That was the moment the last thread snapped. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't announce anything. I didn't explain myself to anyone who wouldn't understand. I walked to the coat check, retrieved my things, and headed for the exit. With every step away from the noise, my chest felt lighter, even as fear crept in. Outside, the night air hit my face, cool and grounding. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration behind me. Laughter, music, applause, life going on without me, exactly as it always had. I took out my phone and stared at the screen. Messages from relatives would start coming soon. Questions, advice, minimizations. I knew the script. I had lived it my entire life. I turned the phone off. In that quiet, something settled inside me. A decision, solid and terrifying and calm all at once. I wasn't leaving for the night. I wasn't taking space. I wasn't cooling off. I was done. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I wanted revenge, though the thought flickered briefly. I was leaving because I finally understood that love without respect is not love. It's control. As I walked away from the venue, I realized the most shocking part of the night wasn't what my parents said on that stage. It was how clearly I saw them afterward. And how clearly I saw myself choosing, for the first time, not to stay where I was only tolerated. I didn't know yet how I would leave forever. I didn't know the logistics, the fallout, or the cost, but I knew something irreversible had already happened. I had stopped waiting for permission to walk away. And once that happens, there is no going back. I didn't go home after I left the venue. I drove without a destination, letting the silence of the car swallow everything I was feeling. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, which surprised me. I had expected to break down, to cry until I couldn't see the road. Instead, I felt clear. Heavy, yes, but clear in a way I had never experienced before. Like a door had finally closed behind me, sealing off a part of my life I no longer needed to keep revisiting. My phone stayed off the entire drive. That decision alone felt radical. For years, I had been trained to stay reachable, available, responsive. Turning my phone off felt like breaking a rule I didn't even remember agreeing to. But I knew that the moment I turned it back on, the noise would start. Questions. Excuses. Damage control. I wasn't ready for their version of what happened. When I finally parked, it was in front of a small hotel not far from the city. Nothing fancy, just quiet. I checked in with a neutral face, took the key card, and went up to my room. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, the bed unfamiliar. And for the first time that night, I sat down and let the weight of what I had done settle in. I had walked out on my parents' wedding anniversary. That sentence echoed in my head, not with guilt, but with disbelief. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would do something like that, I would have laughed. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the daughter who stayed, who smoothed things over, who never embarrassed anyone. And yet there I was. I turned my phone back on the next morning. The screen lit up instantly. Missed calls. Voicemails. Messages stacked on top of each other, like they had been waiting to spill out the moment I allowed them. My mother's name appeared first. Then my father's. Then relatives I hadn't heard from in years. I didn't listen to the voicemails right away. I knew what they would say without hearing them. Confusion framed as concern. Justifications disguised as explanations. A careful rewriting of the night that somehow wouldn't include the word humiliation. I started with the text messages. My mother wrote that they were worried. She said I disappeared suddenly and people noticed. She asked if I was okay. There was no acknowledgement of what was said on stage. No apology, just confusion that centered their discomfort. Not my pain. My father's message was shorter. He said we needed to talk. He said I shouldn't have taken things so personally. He said families joke like that, and I embarrassed them by leaving early. Embarrassed them. I felt something tighten in my chest, not painfully, but firmly, like a lock clicking into place. Relatives chimed in next. Some told me my parents meant well. Others said I misunderstood. A few suggested I should apologize to keep the peace. The same phrase kept appearing over and over again, written in different ways by different people. Keep the peace. I realized then that peace, in my family, had always meant my silence. I didn't respond right away. I took a shower. I let the water run until my skin felt too warm. I watched the steam fog up the mirror and tried to imagine what going back would look like. Sitting across from my parents, listening as they explained themselves, watching them minimize what happened until I started doubting my own memory. I had done that dance too many times before. My mother called again later that afternoon. I answered this time, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to hear her tone. I wanted to know if there was even a hint of understanding. She sounded tired, irritated, not remorseful. She said I had overreacted. She said they were just being honest. She said parents are allowed to express disappointment. She said I should have stayed and talked it through instead of making a dramatic exit in front of everyone. I waited until she finished. Then I asked her a simple question. I asked her if she would have said the same things if there hadn't been a microphone and an audience. There was a pause on the line. Long enough to matter. She said that wasn't the point. That answer told me everything. My father took the phone next. His voice was controlled, authoritative, the same voice he had used my entire life when he wanted the conversation to end on his terms. He said I needed to come home so we could resolve this as a family. He said running away wasn't mature. He said I was proving his point by acting emotional. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told him calmly that I wasn't coming home. He laughed, a short sound that carried disbelief more than humor. He said I was being ridiculous. He said I would cool off. He said I always did. That's when I realized they still believed this was temporary. They thought this was a tantrum. I told them both something I had never said before. Not out loud, not directly. I told them I was done trying to earn respect from people who enjoyed withholding it. I told them that what happened on that stage wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a confirmation. I told them that leaving wasn't an impulse, it was a decision. My mother accused me of being cruel. My father accused me of being ungrateful. Neither apologized. I ended the call. After that, things escalated quickly. My parents showed up at my apartment without calling. I wasn't there. They left messages saying we needed to talk face to face. They contacted friends. They contacted extended family. They framed my absence as a problem that needed fixing. The more they pushed, the more certain I became. Because not once did they ask what I needed. A week later, I did something that made the decision real. I packed. Not angrily. Not in a rush. I packed methodically, deliberately, choosing what came with me and what didn't. I took clothes, documents, personal items. I left behind things tied to memories that no longer felt safe to revisit. I notified my landlord. I requested a transfer at work. I booked a one-way ticket. Each step felt surreal, like I was watching myself from a distance. But with every box sealed, every form submitted, the fear loosened its grip. The day before I left, my father sent one last message. He said if I walked away now, I shouldn't expect things to be the same when I came crawling back. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I blocked his number. I blocked my mother's too. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I finally understood that access to me had always been their power. Cutting that access was the only way to make the decision irreversible. When I boarded the plane, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I wasn't just leaving a place. I was leaving a role I had been trapped in my entire life. As the plane lifted off, I didn't look back out the window. I didn't need to. Because somewhere between the stage at that anniversary and the quiet hum of the cabin, I had crossed a line I would never uncross. They reacted exactly how I expected, and I left in a way they could never undo. The first apology arrived 3 weeks after I left, and by then, something important had already changed. I was no longer waiting for it. I was unpacking boxes in a city where no one knew my parents' names, where no one had watched me grow up under a microscope, where my worth wasn't tied to how well I played a role. When the message appeared, it felt like a sound from another room, distant and easy to ignore. I had moved quickly, not out of panic, but out of certainty. Once the decision settled inside me, momentum followed. I found a small apartment with large windows and uneven floors, the kind of place that felt imperfect but honest. I bought a second-hand couch, a cheap coffee table, and a lamp that gave off warm light instead of the harsh brightness I was used to. Every choice felt intentional. Every choice felt like mine. Work helped more than I expected. In a new environment, I wasn't their daughter. I was just competent, reliable, respected. People listened when I spoke. They didn't interrupt. They didn't smile politely and dismiss what I said 5 minutes later. That alone felt like relief moving through my body, loosening knots I hadn't realized were permanent. I didn't talk about my parents at first. I didn't need to. Silence this time felt different. It wasn't imposed. It was chosen. When my mother finally left a voicemail that slipped past the block through a new number, her voice sounded softer than I remembered. Careful. She said she had been thinking a lot. She said maybe things had come out wrong at the anniversary. She said she didn't mean for me to feel hurt. She said families say things they don't always mean. She never said sorry for humiliating me. She said sorry that I took it badly. I listened to the message twice. Not because I hoped it would improve, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't mishearing it. The absence of accountability was loud. It reminded me why I left in the first place. Apologies that protect the speaker more than the hurt person are not apologies. They are negotiations. My father tried next. His message came a few days later, longer than usual. He said he didn't realize how serious I was. He said he thought I needed time to cool off. He said people were asking questions, and it was uncomfortable. He said he missed me, though the words sounded more like an afterthought than a feeling. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. He said we should put everything behind us and move forward. Like adults, move forward. As if nothing had happened. As if the stage, the microphone, the laughter, and the eyes on me were details that could be brushed aside if enough time passed. As if I could simply step back into place and pretend the line hadn't been crossed. I didn't call him back. Instead, I went for a walk through my new neighborhood. It was early evening, and the streets were alive in a quiet way. People walking dogs, couples carrying groceries, someone laughing from an open window. Ordinary life, happening without any awareness of my family's drama. I realized as I walked that this was what peace looked like. Not perfection, not approval, just space to exist without being judged. Over time, the messages slowed. The tone shifted. Concern replaced irritation. Irritation turned into confusion. Confusion turned into something that looked like regret, at least on the surface. Relatives reached out saying my parents were struggling, that they hadn't expected me to really leave, that my absence was being felt. That part almost made me laugh. They hadn't expected me to leave forever, because they had never believed I would choose myself over them. The humiliation at the anniversary wasn't a risk in their minds. It was a demonstration of power. And power only works when you believe the other person has nowhere else to go. They were wrong. As weeks turned into months, my life filled in around the empty space they left. I made friends who knew me only as I was now, not as a version shaped by old expectations. I developed routines that grounded me. Morning coffee by the window. Evening walks. Quiet weekends that didn't involve bracing myself for criticism disguised as concern. I noticed changes in my body before I noticed them in my thoughts. My shoulders dropped. My jaw unclenched. I slept through the night without waking up, rehearsing conversations that would never happen. The constant background anxiety I had lived with for years slowly faded, like a sound you don't realize is loud until it stops. The contrast was impossible to ignore. When my mother finally sent a message that included the word, sorry, it landed differently than she probably expected. By then, I had learned what an apology should feel like. It should acknowledge harm. It should accept responsibility. It should not come with conditions or expectations. Her message did none of those things. It focused on how hard this had been for them, how lonely the house felt, how people asked where I was, how they never imagined a speech could cause such damage. I read it, set the phone down, and went back to what I was doing. I didn't respond. That choice felt like the final step. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I finally understood something fundamental. Closure does not require participation from the people who hurt you. Sometimes closure is simply deciding not to reopen a door that cost you too much to close. I thought about the anniversary night often, but the memory changed over time. At first, it was sharp and humiliating. Later, it became instructive. It marked the exact moment I stopped negotiating my worth. The moment I stopped hoping my parents would become different people if I just waited long enough. They didn't change. I did. On the anniversary of that night, 1 year later, I sat alone in my apartment with the windows open and the city humming outside. I made myself dinner. I poured a glass of wine. I thought about how far I had come, not in distance, but in clarity. My parents might always believe they were right. They might always frame my leaving as overreaction or betrayal. They might carry regret that never quite turns into accountability. That no longer mattered, because my life was no longer built around their understanding. The humiliation pushed me out, but what kept me gone was the peace I found afterward. And once you experience a life where your presence isn't tolerated but welcomed, it becomes impossible to go back. Their regret arrived late. My new life arrived right on time. I thought the silence meant it was over. Months had passed without a message slipping through, without a relative testing my resolve, without my parents trying to reframe what happened. I had begun to trust the quiet, to believe that the boundary I set was finally being respected. That was my mistake. Silence, I learned, doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means strategy. The unexpected consequence arrived on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as a familiar name lighting up my phone. I hadn't blocked everyone. I had only blocked my parents. I believed that distance from them was enough. I didn't expect the pressure to come from the outside. It was my aunt. Her voice sounded tense, rushed, the way people sound when they think they're delivering urgent news. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ease into the call. She went straight to the point, telling me my parents were having a hard time, that things had gotten complicated, that people were talking. That phrase caught my attention. People were talking. She explained that word had spread through the family, through their social circles, through the same community that had applauded them at the anniversary. Questions were being asked, not about me but about them. Why I wasn't around. Why I had missed holidays. Why their daughter no longer visited or called. At first, my parents had answered with vague explanations. Busy, traveling, needing space. But stories don't hold when they're repeated too often. Gaps show. Inconsistencies grow. And eventually, someone always asks the wrong question in front of the wrong person. The narrative they tried to control was slipping. My aunt said my parents were embarrassed. She said they felt judged. She said my father was furious that people were questioning his character. She said my mother was exhausted from defending herself. She said the anniversary speech was being remembered differently now, not as honesty, but as cruelty. That was the twist I hadn't expected. The same audience that laughed had started to reconsider. Apparently, someone had recorded the speech. A short clip, nothing dramatic, just enough to capture tone and intent. It had circulated quietly at first, passed between relatives, then friends. People who knew my parents well had begun to hear what I heard that night, without the warmth of celebration to soften it. Context changed everything. My aunt asked if I knew how hard this had been on them. She asked if I understood how damaging it was for their reputation. She asked if I would consider calling them, just once, to clear the air. Clear the air. I thanked her for calling. I told her I needed to think about it. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with disbelief. I had walked away to protect myself. I hadn't planned on consequences reaching back into their world. But here they were. A few days later, my father tried again. This time, he didn't call directly. He sent an email. Long, carefully written, structured like an argument, not a confession. He said he was shocked by how things had escalated. He said people were misinterpreting what was said at the anniversary. He said a private family matter had become public in a way that was unfair. Then he made a request. He asked me to release a statement. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement of harm. A statement. Something short and neutral that would reassure people there was no rift, that everything had been misunderstood, that our family was fine. Reading those words, I felt a familiar chill. The pattern revealed itself immediately. Even now, even after losing me, the priority was image, control, damage management. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they were losing something else. They're standing. My mother followed up the next day with a message that tried a different angle. She said she was scared. She said she didn't recognize her life anymore. She said she never imagined I would disappear so completely. She said she was worried about what people were saying. Again, not worried about me. Worried about perception. I sat with those messages longer than I expected to. Not because I was tempted to respond, but because I needed to understand what they meant. This was the final test. The last attempt. If I answered now, if I stepped back into the story they were trying to rewrite, nothing would change. The humiliation would remain unaddressed. The accountability would still be missing. Only the optics would improve. That realization hurt more than the initial insult, because it confirmed something I had spent my life avoiding. I wasn't a priority to them as a person. I was a reflection. And reflections are only valued when they flatter. I drafted a response and deleted it. Then another. Then I closed my email and put my phone down. I went for a walk, letting the city absorb the noise in my head. By the time I returned, the decision had settled. I wasn't going to save them. I didn't owe anyone a statement. I didn't owe them silence on their terms. And I certainly didn't owe them my presence to stabilize their reputation. The unexpected consequence of my leaving wasn't their regret. It was their exposure. By trying to use me to repair what they damaged, they revealed exactly why I left in the first place. And by refusing, I made something else clear. I wasn't just gone from their lives. I was no longer available to protect their image. That choice carried weight. I could feel it in the tone of the next few messages that trickled in, sharper, more defensive. Then those stopped too. The strategy had failed. I knew then that whatever came next would be final. When people who value control realize they've lost it completely, they either surrender or escalate. And knowing my parents, I understood one thing with chilling certainty. They were not done trying yet. The last attempt came quietly, which was how I knew it was real. No relatives calling on their behalf. No long explanations. No urgency wrapped in concern. Just a single message from my mother that said she hoped I was safe and that she loved me. There was no request attached. No pressure. No mention of the anniversary, the speech, or the damage that followed. It was the closest thing to surrender I had seen from them. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I finally understood something that took me decades to learn. Love that arrives only after control fails is not reconciliation, it's loss management. And I had already paid too much for their comfort. By then, my life had settled into a shape that felt unmistakably mine. Not dramatic, not perfect, just honest. I had routines that grounded me, and relationships that didn't require explanation. I didn't flinch when my phone rang anymore. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head before going to sleep. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment disguised as advice. I was free in small, quiet ways that added up to something profound. I changed jobs 6 months after moving. Not because I needed to escape anything, but because I wanted growth on my own terms. I took a role that challenged me without diminishing me. I spoke in meetings and wasn't talked over. When I succeeded, it was acknowledged without qualifiers. When I made mistakes, they were treated as human, not character flaws. That contrast alone healed parts of me I didn't know were injured. I also learned how different relationships feel when they aren't built on obligation. Friendships where I wasn't the easy one, where I could say no without guilt, where my absence wasn't punished and my presence wasn't taken for granted. I learned how to let people know me without performing for their approval. There were moments of grief, of course. Healing doesn't erase history. It just changes how much power it has. Sometimes, a song or a date on the calendar would pull me backward for a moment. Sometimes I'd see a family laughing together and feel a dull ache of what could have been. But even in those moments, I never questioned my decision. Because every time I imagined going back, I imagined shrinking again, softening my words, editing my reactions, making myself smaller so other people could stay comfortable. And once you recognize that pattern, once you see how much of yourself it costs, you can't unsee it. I heard through the family grapevine that my parents stopped hosting large gatherings, that they became quieter in their community, that people still asked about me, but less often now. Time does that. It moves on. The story becomes old news. What mattered was that I didn't return to play my role in it. A year after the anniversary, I stood in my apartment on a quiet evening and realized something that startled me. I hadn't thought about proving anything to them in months. Not my success, not my happiness, not my independence. Their absence had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like space. That was when I knew I was truly gone. Leaving forever didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers. First, the physical distance. Then the silence. Then the internal shift where their opinions lost authority over my choices. The day I realized their approval no longer factored into my decisions was the day the last thread broke. I didn't write a letter explaining myself. I didn't make a public statement. I didn't offer closure on their terms. I let my absence speak for itself. Because absence was the only language they hadn't learned how to control. And in that absence, I found something I had never been given at home. Respect. Not because I demanded it, but because I finally refused to accept anything less. People sometimes ask me if I regret leaving the way I did. If I wish I had handled it differently. If I think reconciliation might still be possible someday. I tell them the truth, even when it makes them uncomfortable. I regret staying as long as I did. The humiliation at that anniversary wasn't the cause of my leaving. It was the confirmation. It showed me who my parents were when they had an audience, and more importantly, who they were when they thought I wouldn't walk away. They were wrong. I didn't leave to teach them a lesson. I didn't leave to make a point. I left because something inside me finally chose survival over loyalty, dignity over tradition, and truth over the illusion of family harmony. And I stayed gone because every step forward felt lighter than every step back ever did. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. You don't leave forever because one night goes wrong. You leave forever when staying requires you to disappear.